The men of the Jeanette, those that survived, they returned home as great heroes. They were household names. They were lauded and celebrated. There were blockbuster newspaper stories and magazine stories. There were parades in Manhattan. There were monuments erected to them all over the country. The survivors were entertained by the Tsar of Russia, Alexander III. The story was the subject of best-selling books. The journals and the diaries of the commander became a best-selling book. But it's completely obscure today, as the numbers here bear out. It's a it's a story that slipped through the cracks of history. One place, though, where it is quite well known is this place. This is the Jeanette Monument at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where George DeLong and his men are celebrated as part of the pantheon of great Navy explorer heroes. And when I was on the book tour, a former midshipman came up to me at some point and said, yeah, the Jeanette Memorial, that's something that they used to always require us, almost like a hazing ritual at midnight, to go and count the number of icicles on the monument and report back to the authorities or whatever. I guess it's your tax dollars at work. Okay, so the voyage of the Jeanette was really based on trying to prove or disprove an old idea, an old theory that goes back as far as the Greeks and the Vikings, but really came to be crystallized in this map, a 1592 Mercator map, which showed very clearly an open polar sea. Through the ice, in the symmetrical way, they believed there were portals that led through the ice, and that it was warm up there, and that there was an iron mountain in the center of it, which of course explains why compasses work. Obviously a flawed idea, but once you get an idea like that enshrined in a map, especially a beautiful map, and a widely circulated and important map, it becomes increasingly difficult to dislodge that idea from the public imagination. So what you really had was several centuries of scientists and pseudoscientists and sometimes cranks, and various authors and explorers who tried to prove or disprove the existence of this fantastical body of water. Open polar sea. Of course, the Vikings had an idea. It was called Ultima Thule, someplace beyond the ice where it was warm year-round, and there were various tropical and exotic animals believed to be there. The Greeks had Hyperborea, which they talked about, and believed that there was beyond the ice again a mountain range where the griffins lived, half lion, half eagle. In the 1800s, though, you begin to get a bunch of really bizarre ideas coming out of particularly the United States. John Cleve Sims was one of these kind of cranks who believed that at the top of the world there were these big holes that led down into the earth, and that there were people who lived down there, and they were just dying for us to go find them. And he was very influential. He sold out lecture halls everywhere he went. Members of Congress were taken with his idea. This is what it's supposed to look like from the pages of Harper's Magazine. Sims as whole as it would appear to a lunarian with a telescope. The hollow earth theory, holes at the poles. This idea I thought a very antiquarian, quixotic idea. But then I Googled holes at the poles, and lo and behold, there is this large subculture. I mean, not large, but a fairly intense subculture of people who still believe that there are holes at the poles. And this is supposedly a confiscated, a censored NASA photograph. There are people down there, they want us to find them, but particularly the Obama administration, has done everything it can to prevent us from knowing about its existence. So the idea has been very slow to die and seems to be fairly deeply embedded in our psyche. Jules Verne had popularized the notion of an open polar sea further with the publication of his book, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Although he brought it underground, there were sort of subterranean lakes that in his novel figure into the story. Mary Shelley, of course, was fascinated with the North Pole. Dr. Frankenstein pursues his monster all the way to the North Pole in the novel. Now, moving beyond scientific theory to just fact, we know who lives at the North Pole. We know what's there. Santa Claus is there, and I thought this must be a pretty old idea, but when I was doing the research for the book, I found out that really the idea of Santa being at the North Pole came from this cartoon from Harper's from the 1860s, which shows him with his helpers and his workshop up there. So during the 1860s particularly, you begin to get and 1870s and into the 1880s, you get this intense polar fever that begins to build, particularly in the United States. This nagging, gnawing need to know what was at the top of the world, one of the last unmapped areas. It drove people crazy. And it also had an element of nationalism for the United States. After the Civil War, emerging from the devastation of the Civil War, we began to kind of flex our muscles on the world stage, wanting to compete with the Brits, who had done most of the exploring, of course, the Russians and some of the Scandinavian countries. But we wanted to stake our claim in the Arctic and had recently purchased from the Russians Alaska. And it was a real curiosity about what was north of our new territory. No one had ever been there. Some Arctic whalers had sort of been along the edges of the ice, but no one had ever really seen what was north of Alaska. Now, there were a number of scientists who were interested in this question, but also very much interested in the open polar sea theory. One of them was this guy, Dr. August Petermann, who you alluded to in the introduction. Petermann was the foremost map maker in the world at that time. Google Maps had nothing on this guy. He produced these absolutely beautiful, hand-colored, but mass-produced maps that brought in the latest findings from explorers. When they came back from Africa or they came back from the interior of Australia, he would pencil in the new information. And so these were up-to-date and highly sought-after maps. And from this platform, and he published all these maps in Germany in a place called Gotha, and he was widely sought after. He was popular on the lecture circuit. And on this platform, by virtue of his maps, he was able to kind of promulgate his various theories, almost all of which were wrong, about what was at the top of the world. But people believed him because he was erudite, he was a German scholar, and he also had excellent facial hair, like a lot of the characters in this book. This is one of his masterworks, the Atlas of Physical Geography, his birthplace. I went to Germany and tried to kind of begin to understand his world and the power of maps, the power, especially in that age when there were just a few areas left in the world that had never been touched by man. A monument to Petermann in Gotha. But this begins to show a little of the theories on which the Jeannette expedition was based, and Petermann's idea. We were beginning to learn that the Gulf Stream was a powerful current that brought a lot of heat from the tropics north through the Atlantic Ocean and past England, past Norway. No one knew precisely where it went. And Petermann's theory was that it met the ice, tunneled under the ice, softened the ice as it went, and eventually went to the North Pole. There's another current that they were also beginning to learn about on the Pacific side. I don't know if you can see that. called the Kuroshio, which is indeed a powerful current in the Pacific that goes north towards the Bering Strait. So his theory was beautiful in its symmetry, somewhat grandiose, but was that these two great currents met at the North Pole, and it was part of a massive thermoregulation system of the planet. And the key word here being supposed, open sea, but again, you begin to see these ideas on maps, and it just becomes impossible to get rid of the idea until explorers unfortunately have to go and live or die, suffer at any rate, to prove the theory. Somebody who was captivated by Peterman's ideas was this guy, the third richest man in New York at the time, the publisher and editor of the largest newspaper in the world, the New York Herald. This is James Gordon Bennett Jr., who was this Gilded Age character, a spoiled brat, a guy who got pretty much everything he wanted, a reckless adventurer himself, a lover of spectacle. He was the youngest Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. He won the first transatlantic yacht race. He was famous for driving coaches around Manhattan nude at midnight. He publicly urinated into a grand piano at a party, a salon in New York, which got him ostracized from New York society. And so he said, plague on all your houses, I'm moving to France. So he ran his newspaper by a transatlantic cable from Paris. Then he created the Paris Herald, which became the International Herald Tribune, which still exists and is sort of the last remnant of his empire. Anyway, you can't invent a character as outsized or as grand as Gordon Bennett Jr. This was a newspaper, very influential paper, important paper also because he believed not only in reporting the news, but sort of creating spectacles that would generate more and more news and big blockbuster stories. He had all these fetishes and things like, for example, he was really into Pomeranians. He had hundreds of them. I've seen a lot of dogs here on the Google campus, but he had a particular thing about Pomeranians and consulted them for various pieces of advice. He was also interested in owls. He had stuffed owls, living owls. Owls was the sort of the symbol of his personal symbol and the symbol of the paper. This is the headquarters, which shows owls on the eaves there, and this was interesting. The eyes of the owls lit up in red with red lights, and then they would wink at you at night. One of his many yachts. This is the Lysistrata, which had a 200-seat theater. It had a Turkish bath. And it had padded stalls for his dairy cows, so he could have fresh cream every morning for breakfast. So, this is the Gilded Age, just tremendous sums of money, certain individuals who had and were able to wield a lot of power with this money, and he pretty much got what he wanted. Now, my wife and I, of course, we felt we had to go to Paris to research Gordon Bennett. This is one of his mansions in Paris, a villa in the south of France near Monaco, where he kept the Lysistrata. We barged our way into the house, and still people there living there, and they knew all about Bennett. There were signs of Bennett everywhere, including owls all over the place. Bennett's also famous for bringing international ballooning to the forefront. He created this balloon race, which still exists, the Bennett Cup. So that's one of his legacies. But he's most famous for sending this guy, this is Henry Morton Stanley, to Africa to find Livingston, I presume. Livingston wasn't really lost. He didn't really need to be found, but it made for a great spectacle and a great series of dispatches in the New York Herald. So really, Bennett was looking for an encore to Stanley Livingston when he kind of began to cultivate this idea of bankrolling an expedition to the North Pole to test the theories of August Peterman. He hired this guy to lead the expedition. This is George Washington DeLong, the commander of the Jeannette, a graduate of the Naval Academy, someone who had been to Greenland, had devoted the rest of his life to trying to figure out this planetary enigma. What's up at the North Pole? He wanted to be the first to do it, and to do it for his country and for his Navy and for science. Bennett purchased this vessel, renamed it the Jeannette after his sister, Jeannette Bennett. And DeLong sailed it around the Horn from France to San Francisco in 1878. And in San Francisco, it was massively reinforced for the ice, practically rebuilt. And then they began to stuff it with all the latest American inventions, including Edison's lights, which had just been designed. They were still being perfected. They weren't quite ready, as it turned out. Telephone equipment from Alexander Graham Bell. Telegraph equipment. They wanted to be able to communicate it over vast expanses of the ice. Many kegs of Budweiser beer. They had a state-of-the-art library. They had an organ. They knew they were going into the ice, and this was going to be a long voyage. They had enough food for 3 years. And they left San Francisco in the summer of 1879. 20,000 people were there to celebrate and to send them off into the Arctic. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, just wondering how many people were on the ship.
33 men. Captain DeLong and 32 men. They headed north past Alaska. That last stop was Alaska, where they picked up 40 dogs and 2 Inuit hunters. It was a very international cast of characters. There were 5 or 6 naval officers. There was a surgeon. There was a meteorologist. There was a naturalist. And there was an ice pilot, someone who had a career really in the Arctic as a whaler. And there were 2 Chinese cooks that had been hired in Chinatown in San Francisco. So it's a motley crew of individuals heading north to test Peterman's theories. Went through the Bering Strait, through the Chukchi Sea, past Wrangel Island. They didn't find a warm water current. They did not find the open polar sea. What they found was ice. A lot of it. They got stuck in the ice in September of '79 and began to drift in the ice in a northwesterly direction, and they drifted for 2 years. 2 years. About a mile a day. Every day is more or less like the next, sort of Groundhog Day kind of thing, and presented an interesting dilemma for me as a writer because I didn't know exactly how to tackle the problem of those 2 years. So I did something I didn't think I would ever do, which is kind of a cinematic thing. I had a little break at the end of one chapter, had a next section, and I just said, 1 year later, and because every day was almost identical to the next. So during this 2 years, DeLong had his men out every day measuring the ice, taking lots of measurements of barometric pressure, temperature, specific gravity, all kinds of things that they were trying to, it was like a floating or a drifting ice station, Arctic ice station really, as they worked their way north. During this 2 year period, the men really get to know each other. A lot of togetherness, and some of the characters really emerge as real striking characters in the book. And I grew to know these men, to love them, sometimes to hate them while I was writing them. Some of the ones that really emerged. This is Melville, the engineer, a distant relative of Herman Melville, the writer. An amazing man who could fix anything, and believe me, everything went wrong during this expedition, and he was called upon to, for example, the ship was constantly leaking as the ice was strangling the hull of the vessel. And so he devised a series of windmills to bring up all the excess water, kept the ship afloat for those 2 years. This is Melville as an old man when he became engineer of the entire U.S. Navy and ultimately Rear Admiral. There's Collins, the Irishman, who was the meteorologist and the scientist on board. Interesting man, brilliant man, but unfortunately he had a propensity for delivering puns, like really, really bad puns. And he couldn't help himself. Now, that's fine. We've all been around people like that for 2 days or something. That might be fine. This was 2 years. Everyone wanted to kill Collins. There was Ambler, the surgeon, who saw every kind of malady you can imagine, particularly vitamin deficiencies. There was lead poisoning. There was polar bear liver ingestion problems. I guess that's vitamin A. He saw it all and had to be quite creative in treating these various ailments. One of the ailments that he had to treat was Dannenhauer's case of syphilis. Turned out that the Dannenhauer, who was the navigator and a brilliant man, also a graduate of the Naval Academy, turned out that he had syphilis. And it manifested itself in the form of an eye condition called syphilitic iritis, which required dozens and dozens of operations without anesthesia down in the ship. And he could not tolerate any light whatsoever, so he had to wear these goggles the entire voyage, somewhat symbolizing this voyage, this doomed voyage, that you have essentially a blind navigator. Not a good thing. So they drifted, though. The first year was kind of like this, just all over the place. They circled back on themselves many times, which was extremely frustrating. But finally, the drift kind of smoothed out, and they worked their way to the northwest. DeLong, by this point, had completely given up on the open polar sea theory. He was cursing Peterman's name, but he thought he might not sail to the North Pole, but he might drift there in the ice. If the ship, which had been massively reinforced, if the ship could withstand the pressure, he thought they might drift to the North Pole because they were heading in the right direction. He had dogs. He thought maybe he'd get out on the ice and make a dash for it. Every day, as I mentioned earlier, the men were out on the ice taking measurements of everything. And the log books, which ended up in the National Archives in Washington, they're very heavy, folio-sized books. When I was reading them, I was just thinking, gosh, the journey that these books took to get into National Archives. They're heavy, they're cumbersome. DeLong had to make some strategic decisions about keeping them as things go from bad to worse during the expedition. But there they are. But when I was reading them, I was thinking, this is terrible. This is what a waste of all this energy, all this data, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of data about the condition of the Arctic. And I thought, what a waste. But then I found out that NOAA, in tandem with a group called Old Weather, has been taking the DeLong journals and digitizing all this data and using it ultimately to study the condition of the Arctic. Because when you're talking about global warming, one of the problems they've always had is no one really knows what the condition of the ice was 150 years ago, because to do that, you'd have to go in a time machine back to the 1800s. You'd have to ram yourself in the ice. You'd have to drift for 2 years in the ice and take daily measurements, even hourly measurements. No one would do that, right? Well, someone did, and it's George DeLong and his men. And this is a stretch of the Arctic no one had ever been through before. And these books are proving, and log books are proving extremely valuable now in these studies that are going on. When I do these narratives, I like, whenever possible, to travel to the places I'm writing about. And this story mostly takes place in Arctic sections of Russia. So I got myself a really bad haircut, and I went to Moscow first to get a bunch of permits because unfortunately I couldn't just go across from Alaska. I was going to a lot of restricted areas. So a National Geographic fixer person helped me get these permits in Moscow, and then I flew, 8, 9 time zones east, all the way to the east coast of Siberia to Anadyr, where I picked up this Russian icebreaker. It's not quite fully an icebreaker. It's a reinforced vessel. And headed north. I thought it was pretty ridiculous that I had to travel 13,000 miles to look at my own country, Alaska. Heading north, waving at Sarah Palin as I went, along the northeast coast of Siberia. Amazing place, mostly uninhabited. We did stop at this one village where they had just killed a whale and they were having a festival, summer festival, and invited us ashore, and we stayed there for a few hours. I took this with an iPhone. But there were soldiers with Kalashnikovs that didn't really want us to be there. They ushered us back to the ship, and we headed north in the direction of Wrangel Island, which is where we were going. There was a crew of, there was a French documentary crew that was doing something about woolly mammoths. There were various atmospheric scientists, and then there was just a whole bunch of intense birders, you know, like really, really into birding, professional birders almost. As we headed north, we encountered more and more ice until we got to this place where, this is looking straight down from the bow of the ship, and I just took this again with an iPhone, but gives you some sense of how quickly the ice can build up. And this is in the month of August. So that brought us to a complete halt. We had to back up and refigure our course. But we eventually reached our destination, which was Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island is a very interesting place. It's been called the Galapagos of the High North. It's got a huge amount of wildlife, Pacific walrus and snowy owls and snow geese and Arctic fox and polar bears, lots and lots of polar bear. August Peterman thought that it was a continent. It had only been glimpsed by some Arctic whalers, and it looked pretty large. And he had this grand theory that it was actually Greenland. That Greenland came up over the, not quite the pole, but near the pole, and all the way to the other side, and that this was the tip of Greenland. Another one of his obviously wrong ideas, but an interesting place nonetheless. It's uninhabited. There are 4 Russian rangers who live there, are stationed there. And they were, when we came ashore in these little Zodiac rafts, these Russian rangers were so happy to see us. So happy to see fresh human life. And we were happy that the 2 or 3 cabins that were there were all reinforced on the windows there with bear guards, because there are polar bears everywhere. They congregate in larger and larger numbers there because during the summer, the ice is increasingly unreliable. And this is one of the only scraps of land for thousands of miles in any direction. So this is one of the places that they go. I was there with a photographer named Sergei Gorshkov, who has been going to Wrangel for over a decade, taking these amazing wildlife pictures for National Geographic magazine. And a story that I wrote came out in March of 2013.